Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are going to completely dismantle the myths surrounding Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I know most of us instantly think of him for his dark, creepy tales and haunting poetry, but we're going to uncover his real genius today. We're going to see him not as this chaotic, tortured soul, but as a highly calculating, meticulous architect of modern literature.
So, where did that tortured soul myth even come from? Well, immediately after Poe's death, his literary rival Rufus Wilmot Griswold launched an absolute smear campaign. He wrote a highly slanted obituary under a fake name and even presented forged letters to paint Poe as a depraved, drunken, drug-addled lunatic. And, the public thrilled at the idea of an evil author, so the myth just kind of stuck. But the reality was entirely different. Poe was actually a brilliantly analytical, incredibly disciplined, and frankly, widely feared literary critic who essentially reverse-engineered his stories to perfectly manipulate our emotions.
Here is the roadmap for our explainer today. 1. The architect of effect. 2. Defining Gothic horror. 3. Inventing the modern mystery. And 4. Blueprint for future masters. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the architect of effect. At the absolute core of Poe's genius, especially when looking at his short stories, was his theory known as the unity of effect. Poe firmly believed that originality was the ultimate mark of genius. He actually argued in his essays that a work with super obvious preachy meanings completely ceases to be art. Instead, he believed any work worthy of praise has to focus intensely on one single specific effect. Basically, if a word or a sentence doesn't tend directly toward that one targeted emotional gut punch, it's extraneous and it's gotta go. To give you an idea of how strict he was about this, in his essay, The Philosophy of Composition, Poe claimed he used this highly calculated method to engineer his famous poem, The Raven. He figured out the exact effect he wanted first, which was mournful and never-ending remembrance, and then he literally built the work backward from there. Now, sure, some later critics, like T.S. Eliot, kind of questioned if Poe really plotted it out with that much cold mathematical calculation, but honestly, it proves the larger point. Poe wasn't writing in fits of chaotic, drunken inspiration. He viewed writing as a literal architectural science. Moving right along to Section 2, defining Gothic horror. So, how did he apply this to Gothic fiction? Well, to achieve that very specific emotional impact, Poe repeatedly stacked highly morbid themes. He heavily utilized the physical signs of death, the gruesome nature of decomposition, and, this is a big one, he tapped into a very real, very terrifying 19th century paranoia, the fear of premature burial. By carefully layering these elements together, Poe was actively employing his unity of effect to target the public's taste for the terrifying. He wasn't just throwing spooky stuff at the wall to see what stuck, he was psychologically intimidating his readers on purpose. Because of this, Poe actively championed dark romanticism. He prioritized those intense emotional thrills over preachy life lessons, and that put him in direct rebellion against the massive transcendentalist movement happening at the time, led by figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson. Poe absolutely hated when a story tried to preach a lesson. He openly mocked those Boston writers, jokingly dismissing them as frog-pondians. He criticized their work as wildly derivative, famously calling it metaphor run mad and mysticism for mysticism's sake. For Poe, that emotional thrill was the whole shebang. Which brings us to Section 3, inventing the modern mystery. It's such a fascinating question to ask. Think about the modern mystery genre or our current true crime obsession. Think about all those brilliant, eccentric detectives on television and in your favorite novels. Where did they actually come from? Because I can tell you, they definitely didn't just appear out of thin air. They started right here, with Edgar Allan Poe. He introduces incredibly observant, brilliant detective named C. Auguste Dupin in early tales like The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Through Dupin, Poe channeled his own keen analytical abilities, literally the exact same abilities he used to crack real-world ciphers and cryptograms in local newspapers to establish the absolute foundational tropes of detective fiction. The brilliant sleuth, the completely baffling crime scene, the step-by-step deductive reasoning. Poe essentially invented the entire formula right there. And hey, don't just take my word for it. Listen to this. Each is a root from which a whole literature has developed. Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it? That's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, directly testifying that Poe's work was the absolute genesis of the mystery genre. Let that sink in. Without Dupin, there is no Sherlock Holmes. Period. And finally, we arrive at Section 4, Blueprint for Future Masters. The rapid expansion of Poe's influence is honestly staggering. Take a look at this timeline. In 1838, he wrote his only complete novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Decades later, in 1897, the legendary Jules Verne actually wrote a science fiction sequel to it. Fast forward to the 1920s, and pioneers of horror are building directly on Poe's foundation. And by 1946, the Mystery Writers of America decide to name their highest annual award, the Edgars, in his honor. From poetry to sci-fi to modern horror and global mystery, his influence just exploded. Look at H.P. Lovecraft, one of the most famous horror authors of the 20th century. He didn't just casually borrow Poe's scary themes. In his letters, Lovecraft actually called Poe his god of fiction. But more importantly, Lovecraft directly utilized Poe's specific literary theory, that unity of effect we discussed earlier, as the absolute architectural foundation for his own terrifying short stories. He literally used Poe's blueprint. And this influence totally transcends books. Even cinematic legends credit their entire trajectory directly to Poe. Alfred Hitchcock stated incredibly plainly, "It's because I liked Edgar Allan Poe's stories so much that I began to make suspense films." The undisputed master of cinematic suspense built his visual empire directly on the psychological foundation that Poe laid down way back in the 1840s. It's wild to think about. So, we've seen today how Poe was absolutely not some crazed madman scribbling in a drunken frenzy, but a highly disciplined architect of human emotion. I want to leave you with this thought. The next time you're enjoying a gripping mystery novel, a tense psychological thriller on screen, or a scary story that just perfectly targets your deepest fears, ask yourself, would it even be possible without the meticulous, calculating architecture of Edgar Allan Poe?